Again, my name is Elliott Smith. By quick introduction, I spent over 20 years of my career in power generation, working with Siemens and formerly Westinghouse on the OEM side, and with CH2M on turnkey EPC projects, mostly in the U.S. and some in Latin America and Australia. So we're going to talk a little bit about that very subject: gas-fired power, coal power, renewables a little bit here, distributed power, and the provocative question of the day: are we at peak gas-fired power? Coming from that industry, certainly a very interesting question for me. Understanding we're a little tight on time, I will tell you I tend to present fast, so you won't have to tell me to slow down. Or you might have to tell me to slow down, but you won't have to tell me to speed up. So please, if I'm rattling too fast, just let me know and I'll take a pause. So I'm not going to go into these up front, but one at a time because they come back anyway. So key messages for the day. The big first one is natural gas demand is growing primarily through power, driven by low capital and fuel costs and regulations on coal plants. So for the past probably 10 years, the coal industry has been getting hit with varying regulations, and that's been causing challenges there. And of course, I've watched the gas turbine large frame combined cycle market. It's very cyclic for decades. It's been on and off for different reasons, and that's going to continue. So one key message that I would put forth, it's not in the presentation, but you'll see this in everything. There's two things we can count on today, and that is change and the acceleration of the rate of change. And that doesn't just apply to iPhones anymore. Now it applies to the power industry and oil and gas and petrochemical industries. And everywhere in the world we're seeing more of this. So again, this is a little sidebar, but it's an undercurrent that I've seen throughout the power industry across the board, and that is the Internet of Things, the automation, the digitalization of this industry. Efficiency improvements, you'll see as an underlying theme, have affected everything and everybody, not just the power generation itself, but also the users of power, industrial and commercial. People are putting in LED light bulbs. Little things like that have permeated that and impacted these industries. So interesting point of note here, the natural gas demand shows a large growth in the power sector. And I'll try to be fair because there are two screens, right? 5.3% CAGR over the recent years, and that would make you want to say, hey, this is great. Let's go start building combined cycle gas-fired power plants, big ones, because the gas demand is really going up. But we have to consider and preface that with the fact that there's been a good bit of gas switching for old oil-fired boilers, coal plants that have been switching to gas, coal plants that are no longer going to be around because of the tightening emissions standards, so the retirements and replacement with gas-fired power. Had the opportunity recently to attend the Gas Electric Partnership. It was a very good venue, and there was a fellow from AEP in there who was talking about his fleet of 70+% being coal-fired power at an average of 42 years in operation, which is pretty far out there, which certainly says we're going to see more coal-fired retirement, and that's going to help with this as well. But you can see the other natural gas demands have either been negative in some niches and slightly positive in other areas like industrial. So since 2010, and even before that, the natural gas fired net power generation has grown over 6% annually as it's eroding into the coal fleet, which we were just talking about, and a lot of generation additions recently have been made from, of course, renewables. So we're seeing the renewables and the natural gas fired eating into that coal-fired capacity. One point to make here is the modest growth we've seen in renewables. Why you say modest? Well, if you're looking at trillions of kilowatt hours, renewables are really modest compared to that. But in terms of CapEx, it's been quite significant. And a large part of that is being driven by, historically and recently, by the investment tax credits and the production tax credits from the federal government, which have been extended, as many of you may know, for another 4 or 5 years. And that's going to continue to drive investment in renewables, as well as the renewable standards in places like California and New York, who have like 50% goals. So we're going to still see some of that coming into the mix. But in terms of CapEx, really it's pretty hard to beat the large advanced frame combustion turbine projects, the H-class, the J-class. Large frame combustion turbine combined cycle projects are among the lower capital costs you'll see over here on the left when you compare it to other things all the way up to nuclear. Coal is still quite expensive. So when people ask the question, well, what about the coal miners going back to work? This is my own opinion. The coal miners are going to go back to work, and we're going to be exporting more coal. That's where I think it's going to go, because with these dynamics, with gas being clean, with it being inexpensive and abundant for years to come, we won't expect to see a lot of new coal plants being built in the United States. That's just the reality of it. We'll talk a little bit about the Clean Power Plan and how that plays into it as well in a moment. Another interesting point to note on the gas turbine simple cycle, combined cycle, simple cycle's been about 1/3, and it goes way back before 2010. And honestly, being in the industry for over 20 years, that wasn't even so apparent to me because I was building combined cycle. It's more better efficiency. Yes?
Is it primarily for peakers, the simple cycle?
Well, yes. Yes. Simple cycle is primarily for peakers. Interesting thing is that many of the large combined cycle plants, 500, 600, 700 megawatt range, were designed to be base load, but people were operating them as peakers, which is really not so good for them heating and cooling those units. So a lot of this sort of happened in the industry. So one thing that the large turbine manufacturers have been doing is trying to make their engines more nimble, let's say, to get up into 10 minutes in a large frame to base load, 30 minutes in a combined cycle. Remember what I said, change in the acceleration of the rate of change. You think it's a base load plant, but it turned out not to be. So in the natural gas consumption for power generation, this quickly shows the mix, and it's maybe interesting to note here, it's actually the utilities that we've seen a larger increase in consumption over the past years for natural gas. So here these big coal players have been adding more large-scale natural gas, but that doesn't mean the independent power producers by any means are dragging behind. So you can see kind of a relatively even split with a little bit more lately from the utility side of the equation. Next key message here, natural gas power generation likely to peak in 2017 or 2018 due to various factors, some of which we've talked about, including, as Uday alluded to earlier, potentially some modest increase in gas prices. We don't expect to see the $14 a million BTU kind of hits like I did, and watched my industry crash and come back to life. We expect to see it be stable, and I've heard from a number of players out there for the last couple of years, $4 is kind of the high end around there that we expect to see, as we talked about here today. But the demand growth in the U.S. is actually slowing. So that seems like a little bit of a dichotomy, but we're looking at 0.8% average over the last 5 years for electricity demand growth. And you say, why is that? And again, a lot of that's due to efficiency, industrial efficiency improvements, as well as the average home owner making upgrades to their homes. So what we're seeing here from resources like EIA is that the net generation is projected to peak or flatten out and likely stagnate a little bit going up through 2025. Now, my mother always told me never get into forecasting, there's no future in it. But we're going to try a little bit here. But the interesting thing to note here is, okay, this is net generation for the U.S., trillions of kilowatt hours. Go back to 2010, it's around 4. And looking out to 2025, it's around 4.1. So, I mean, really, it's not moving. What's happening is things are shifting within that mix, where we're getting our power from. We're seeing upticks in distributed generation, renewables, we're seeing less coal, et cetera. Nuclear's probably got a while before it might recover again in this country, but that's kind of the mix as you see. So where you see this other at the very top, other includes renewables, hydro, nuclear, and then of course the rest is just the gas and coal comparison. So 4 key reasons that we're seeing for that are gas price, moderate increases in gas price, other gas monetization options as Uday and Ron were discussing, coal plant utilization changes, and of course the impact of renewables. Low gas prices, maybe you're going to creep up a little bit, but that shouldn't really affect that part of the industry a whole lot because it's going to be stable for a long time. Non-power options, as Ron had covered, and Uday some and others will today, so I won't go into that. The coal plant utilization rates increasing. So again, this is going to be would be impacted by the Clean Power Plan if it were to go forward. We'll talk about that in a moment. And last but not least, renewables are actually becoming more competitive, as is energy storage. So we're going to see those costs continue, theoretically so far, to creep down. So, onto the Clean Power Plan. The new administration is likely to drop it, and Paris Accord is up for grabs there too. We'll see how those changes happen. But I've done some clean air projects for coal plants in the past years, and it was at a time when people knew, or they thought they knew, what the regulations were going to do to them. But for the last 5, 6, 7+ years, they didn't know. They were waiting on the EPA to say, okay, draw the line and we'll decide. And one reality is carbon sequestration and capture is quite expensive. So having done scrubber projects, SCR, all that, they can still be economical, keep the plants running for years to come. Carbon sequestration, depending on the need, can become a large chemical heavy process where your coal plant can become, for lack of better words, a large chemical plant that makes some power. And it's hard sometimes for the owners to keep that economical. So I'm not going to go into the deep detail of this slide. You're probably glad of that. But the essence is the Clean Power Plan is not a mercury and NOx and SOx and hazardous materials reduction plan. It is pretty much a carbon or CO2 reduction program with goals to get below 26% below 2005 emissions by 2020 and 30% by 2030. So again, these slides will be available, so I'm not going to go into the details of it for interest of time. However, you can see the state requirements for that Clean Power Plan vary widely by state, some up to 40% reduction, which essentially, when you look at those kind of figures, would kill a lot of operating coal plants. So on that subject, the interesting thing to note is the planned retirements over 2017 to 2027 really don't change a whole lot. What really would change with the Clean Power Plan, this one, would be that you may see some retirements happening earlier because they institute the rule and it makes some plants uneconomical and they say we're going to shut them down. So again, the overall in gigawatts, it's not a massive change, it's more the timing. The interesting thing, if the Clean Power Plan doesn't go ahead, the coal-heavy ISOs regions, you'll see it says a decrease in energy price, but it's actually the difference in what it would cost to make energy. It's around 14.7%, and then for the gas-heavy regions where there's still coal, it's around 5%. So, summary of what that means is if the Clean Power Plan is put into place, there'll be a lot of heavy cost impacts to those coal operators that would typically translate to electric bills. So, distributed generation growing due to high demand charges and improving competitiveness of the technology. This is something I found really interesting. The distributed generation has come down a lot in cost over the recent years, as has battery storage and other storage technologies. So we're seeing, and as our friend from AEP that was at the Gas Electric Partnership Conference had said, the big utilities are looking a lot more at all of the above, the renewables, the distributed generation, two-way power instead of one-way power, the net metering. So All of these things, new technologies coming together, is essentially saying that a combined heat and power application, the total cost cents per kilowatt hour on average in the U.S. is around 9.5 cents a kilowatt hour. All right, to do a total CHP with like a recip engine distributed generating kind of technology, where the national average for regular power generated now is around 8.5 cents. So it's approaching parity very quickly. But then if you put the demand charges on it, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's when you're at peak power and the power company hits you with a very large bill that's a lot bigger than the bill that it takes to generate the electricity you're buying. California, New York, places like that have massive demand charges. So here's California, for example, with a demand charge, average power is 21 cents. In Australia, they're seeing 25 to 38. So what happens if you have your own distributed generation is you have no demand charges. And not only that, but you could actually, in a lot of cases, sell power back to the grid and get your own taste of some of those demand charges, which is pretty nice. And these kind of things are driving more of this. And if you look at recip technologies, for example, Jenbacher from GE and Wärtsilä, 10 to 18 megawatt gas recip engines running 50% efficiency. Not bad. And then if you do a combined heat and power, or better yet, district heating, which hasn't caught on so well in the US, but it's big in Europe and other places, you can get to 90% efficiency, which is not only not bad, it's darn good, right? So there's a lot of upsides we're going to see with distributed generation, and of course, that includes also the solar and wind kind of technologies. So looking more to the right side of this chart, the big takeaway is, if you look at distributed generation by things like recip engines, the traditional has been the 2 megawatt Caterpillar Cummins data center hospital backup diesel sitting there most of the time. But now folks are looking more to the 10 megawatt and up scale because of the higher efficiencies. Again, up to 50% versus 35 to 38%, and also burning natural gas, which is clean. And they also don't use water, which if you've ever worked on a large combined cycle power plant, there's a lot of demineralized water and high costs and treatment and all that come with that. So the latest projections here is an 8% growth projected through 2020, with solar distributed generation actually growing the fastest. So see some figures over here for that. And natural gas is expected to be kind of the upcomer in that realm going forward with the new technologies available and the higher efficiencies. Also, the cost for these gas recip engines, turbines, and microturbines and batteries are all dropping and expected to reduce further. So the conventional power market, natural gas, coal, everybody, they're all seeing these rapid changes and drops in costs. Back to the investment tax credits and production tax credits for wind and solar. Those are going to go away in another 4 or 5 years. But by that time, a lot of those technologies are going to continue to drop down until they see closer to parity with more conventional power resources. So last quick section here I've got is on the industrial sector segments. So we're seeing, as we're talking about feedstocks for refining and petrochemical, fertilizer, et cetera, there's a number of industrial sector segments. And yes, we're going to see a little bit of growth there, although we're talking about not stellar growth. The projected capital investments by type, we're looking at here large investments in the feed stage and under construction for ethylene. Interesting to see methanol and gas to liquids in here have very large feed projections, but not so much under construction in contrast. Just some food for thought. So what we're expecting to see through 2025 is around a 1.6% compound annual growth rate through that period, as opposed to as Uday said, a lot of these projects are already underway. So this is kind of the next wave. We're going to see, again, some incremental increase expected there. So another thing, and then kind of the last point is gas-fired generation is getting more efficient. I know the large combined cycle plants now, they're claiming up to 63% efficiency, which is quite good. A lot of that's being driven by the automation and the digitalization with help of companies such as ABB doing this work. And so we're going to expect to see not so much mechanical advances, firing temperature advances, but maybe more iPhone type, app type data lakes and all of this that they're drawing from. The analytics are going to help draw some more efficiency and eke out more there. But at the same time, as we can see, the trend is now it takes only 75% as much energy to generate $1 billion in GDP as it did in 1995. Well, why is that? In large part, just one sec, efficiency, not just of the power generation, but of everybody using it. So everyone's trying to push their production, their plants, manufacturing, homes, et cetera, for higher efficiency so they can be more competitive. Hence the reason for flat. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this dollars, 1995, is that constant dollars or in a sense what I'm saying is same amount of energy if the inflation would basically allow you to generate $1 billion of
Yeah, that's
energy.
constant. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
so
not.
yeah, it's not it's not because of inflation.
That's right. It's because of efficiency. Yes, sir. Yeah, we try to keep that. Yeah, you see, you could confuse it really quickly. And I believe, I'm happy to say for all of you who've been patient and waiting for the little bit of break time that we have reached that point. If there's any questions, I'll be glad to take some now, and I'll also be available during the break if anyone wants to ambush me out there. Couple though.
Quick question
Yes,
about nuclear. It does present create a lot of power generation now. Those plants are very old. Some of them are scheduled for mothballing in the coming years. What's the status on that?
Well, yeah, some are, and then there's a couple of them that are actually scheduled to come online. They're still struggling through 2019 to 2020, around there in the southeast. So there's actually more expected to come online. I don't have exact dates and that data in my head right now on the nuclear, but you're right, some of them are aging and there would be some opportunity there. Most of what folks have been tracking these days have been the coal-fired because there's so much of it expected to retire. The nuclear side, you have 1,100 megawatts come down, you could put a couple gas turbines in and you're done. So certainly there will be some of that, but I think the overall impact is going to be much less. Yes, sir.
Increased coal production leads to increased coal exports from the U.S. My question, where? Because everybody else has the same concerns that we have.
Well, I wouldn't quite say it exactly like that. I know Europe has been taking in our coal. India.
LNG, they like gas too over there.
Absolutely. However, they have been taking. India has been taking our coal. In fact. Yes. Well, you know, that's if you look at and actually nuclear, back to that question combined, where's the nuclear and coal plants being built these days? They're not here. They're in India. And China. I mean, they were pumping out a coal plant every month kind of over there. So although that may be slowing down a bit, that's where a lot of that infrastructure is going to go. So I think, again, my opinion about the Trump concept of putting coal miners back to work, it was a good political move maybe to get some base mobilized, but the point is it doesn't equate to more coal going to the coal plants we have. They're not going to need more coal than they use now, and no one's likely to build a coal plant anytime soon here in the U.S. So if those miners are going back to work, the question is, where's all that coal going? Where exactly is to be determined, but I would expect most of it's going to be exported, or they're going to be slowing down on that job growth that he's talking about.
Quick question along the same lines. Where is coal gasification fitted into all this? I know coal is all the main fuel, both in China and
Yes.
US, right? So
Yeah.
where does that fit in? Complex question.
It fits. It's not bad at all. I've had some experience with gasification IGCC projects, and the reality is they're expensive. They're very expensive. And so what happens though? There is a project that's been going on for years, Texas Clean Energy Project here, that if and when it all gets to fruition, how does it become economic? economically viable? The answer is they gasify this coal, they burn it in a combined cycle, and then they're also taking out CO2 and they're using it for enhanced oil recovery.
So my point is, see, there's a concept of Chindianizing the technology. You know, Shell is a good example. They couldn't sell it anywhere, and eventually they built plants in China, and technology was developed using their license in India. So where does this fit in? So meaning the fuel is there, and it needs to, cost has to come down. So what is, what are you seeing there?
Well, I'm focusing this discussion and forum mostly on the U.S., of course, and this is where it's really challenged. I mean, there's been some IGCC projects before gas was as cheap as it is now that are up and running. But again, it's more of, to me, it's more of a great experimental technology to prove it out. But the actual Fischer-Tropsch process, all the steps that go in and the equipment that go in are quite expensive. And if you can get up to 65% combined cycle and you can get to 90% in a combined heat and power or district heating operation with, call it cheap technology, you know, I mean, you might not need any water, you're not gasifying coal. It's really it's an economic question. I mean, physically it's viable, it's just economically challenging.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank
Elliott.
you, thank
Very
you.
good.
My pleasure. Thank you.